Welcome to today's episode of BMA NMWA Counterstory. I'm Addie Gayoso from the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Veronica Betancourt from the Baltimore Museum of Art. And as always, we are extremely live.
Today we consider the stories and perspectives that persist in history books, in museums, in popular culture. Today's artists, Sonia Clarke and Stephanie Syjuco, question these dominant narratives and provide a counter story, an alternative or opposing narrative. They ask us to rethink the familiar and critique the underpinnings of white supremacy or imperialism that shape dominant narratives in US history. Today we're starting our conversation with a look at flags. Flags are highly charged objects. When you think of a flag, what image comes to mind? What feeling does that flag elicit?
I mean, flags show up everywhere. They are outside school buildings, government offices, on the battlefield, on front porches, and even on the moon. So they're used to lay claim to land, to proclaim identity and values, and sometimes to intimidate or other. Thinking about flags, today's artwork sort of flip that script. Sonia Clarke work investigates the Confederate battle flag as a commonplace symbol, often altering or deconstructing it to kind of show the labor that is required to dismantle racism. And Stephanie Syjuco's art critiques US imperialism and white supremacy, both with flags and other textiles and a range of media.
Mm-hmm. First, we welcome Hannah Shambrew, my colleague at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. Hannah is the exhibition coordinator and a co-curator of our current special exhibition, Sonia Clarke, Tatter, Bristle, and Mend, which is on view at the Women's Museum through June 27th.
Which is great because it's an extension, so you've got more time to see it. But additionally, I want to invite you to stay tuned because after we talk with Hannah, artist Stephanie Syjuco will be joining us live.
Mm-hmm. Great. Hi, Hannah. Thank you for joining us today. We're thrilled you're here, calling in from DC. Before we get started and kind of dig deep into the flag works that Sonia Clarke has created, can you tell us a little bit more about what makes the exhibition at the Women's Museum special?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, it's especially great to be able to present Sonia Clarke's work here in DC because the artist is actually from DC. She grew up here. She's from Northwest DC. So it's great to be able to bring all of her work back here and present it at NMWA. I think another thing that's really exciting about this exhibition is that it is the first survey of her work. Other exhibitions of her work have focused more on a specific body of work or a material that she's working with. And this is the first exhibition that really showcases the span of her career. We have some of her earliest works from the 1990s. The earliest work in the exhibition is from 1994 through to more recent works from all the way up to 2019, including one work done in neon that we're exhibiting for the very first time in this exhibition. And it's really exciting. I think, the exhibition shows a really great range of her work. It really shows the breadth of her career in terms of material, as well as the different themes she explores. So we have some of her beaded works. We have works that she's included human hair. We have works where she's sculpted monumental sculptures out of combs. And then, of course, as well, we have a number of her flag works too.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's interesting because Clarke really sort of identifies as a textile artist, but she's exploring a variety of materials and really digging deep in terms of meanings that she explores in her work. Today, specifically, we are going to focus on her investigations of flags, specifically the Confederate battle flag, which is a charged symbol many of us have a mental picture of, as well as what I call her counterpoint, which is the Appomattox flag of truce, which is a relatively unknown object that Clarke calls the flag we should know. And I think we're going to bring up an image of one of her works called Memorial Cloth. And I wonder, Hannah, if you could tell us a little bit, first introduce folks to what the Appomattox flag of truce is and why it was important for Sonia Clarke to recreate this particular flag.
Sure. Yeah. So this is a body of work. This particular work is called Monumental Cloth Sutured. And this is a body of work in which she is exploring this, what she calls a Confederate flag of truce. And that was the flag that was used to surrender at the Battle of the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia on April 9th, 1865. So just about almost exactly 156 years ago, almost to the day. And that was the flag that was used to surrender, which effectively ended the US Civil War. And that cloth, because it was sort of used at the end of a battle, it was just, this linen dishcloth. This work here, she's, recreated it out of hand-woven linen. But as you can see, it's sort of this like whitish linen with 3 red stripes going down the center of it. And so this was sort of used as the flag of surrender. And one half of the original flag is preserved at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. That's where Sonia Clarke first encountered this flag as an historic object. And then fragments of the rest of it are in different collections around the country, but some of it is also preserved at Appomattox still today.
It's so interesting to think about a piece that has, even in its unity, it sort of talks and makes very visible that it has these 2 component parts, and that suture is something that's really important in terms of both physically and I think also conceptually binding it together.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, she talks about this flag as, more a symbol of reconciliation. One thing she often points out is that the Confederate battle flag is the pervasive symbol that we see everywhere, really, of the Civil War. But there is this other flag. The battle flag is this very divisive symbol, whereas this flag of truce is sort of symbolic of the brokering of peace, laying the basis for reconciliation from the divisiveness that came from the war. And so one thing she really questions is, why isn't this the pervasive symbol? Why isn't this known? This is not the symbol that we see commonly in history books. It's not the symbol that is commonly taught. It's certainly not a symbol that we see widespread at all. But it's sort of this flip side of that history of the Civil War and the ending of the Civil War. And I think you're absolutely right. The suturing of it together is emblematic, of course, both of the physical pieces of the this artifact that is in all different places, but also again this sort of rejoining of 2 sides and this reconciliation.
And
also, I think really, sorry, Veronica. I think the suture is interesting. It's really rough, right? And it sort of makes us think also about physical battle wounds as well, and really sort of makes me reflect on those who did sort of fight in the Civil War and sort of the loss of life and limb on behalf of on both sides of that war. So I think there's that interesting connection to sort of physical pain and reconstruction in a way.
Well, and thinking about the notion of how this particular work was made, I really appreciate that Sonia Clarke is not just sort of showing the intact object, as it were, but also has created different fragments. And I know that we have some images of those monumental fragments, which also let us sort of take a closer look at the fact that Sonia Clarke is really showing her craft in terms of being a textile artist. So, we can see that this is something that is woven by her. Which, I think for me is significant in that it's sort of, in a sense, she had to make it because it didn't exist. Whereas if we think about one of the Confederate battle flags that is so popularized, seen everywhere from belt buckles to tourist paraphernalia to the January 6th insurrection, it's all over the place. Whereas the truce flag and sort of the related fragments of it are something that are, they're in the archives, they're in museums, they're in places of institutional care and also kind of institutional memory.
Definitely. And one thing I want to point out, I think kind of related to that, is actually the size of this artwork. This one is called Monumental Fragment, and it's from 2019. And, you kind of think of a fragment of something as being a small piece of it, which, of course, the historic object of this flag as it's preserved is in many fragments, but this work is actually much larger than it looks. It's about 4 feet by 3 feet. So it is really, she's kind of enlarged this fragment to the size of a standard flag that you might think of when you see, a flag hanging. And I think, one thing she's sort of proposing here is, why isn't this flag a monument? She's stated before, monuments don't have to be made of steel. They don't have to be made of marble like we typically think of them. But that, this piece of cloth and this fabric could really be monumental as well. And as you point out, it's hand woven, it's handmade. She's dyed, parts of the linen red by hand. I believe it was made on a loom. So, there is this care that's gone into making this object and this time. And, it's, of course, a bit of a tedious process to weave something like this.
Yeah.
So I think that, thoughtfulness and reflection and care that has gone into the making of the object certainly ties into that as well.
I think it's also really tapping into, this flag was a humble dishcloth, right? And so it also sort of her handwork and going into making this is reflective also of the work that, that goes into housework and using a dishcloth and how it's sort of transformed into something really, from something really humble and sort of inconsequential to something so meaningful and powerful. I want to think a little bit about sort of the difference. Sonia Clarke talks a lot about how she really wants to amplify this particular, the flag of truce, and really in a way dampen the Confederate battle flag. So thinking about the difference between the flag that we should know, as she calls it, the one we just looked at, and the one that's so prevalent in visual culture and material culture, I want to turn to Sonia Clarke's work with and critique of the Confederate battle flag, which has been a reoccurring consideration for her for more than 10 years. 2 key works in our show are entitled Unraveling and Unraveled. Both titles are verbs indicating ongoing and past actions. And we do have a video, Hannah, we're hoping you can talk a little bit through how these works are not just physical objects, but also have performative elements as well.
Sure. Yeah. So both of the works that Addie just mentioned are from 2015. This is Unraveling. As you can see, it's cut off a little bit to show the participation element, but it is a Confederate battle flag. There's a performative element to this piece. So Sonia Clarke begins the work of unraveling the flag in her studio. And then in the galleries, she invites visitors to come and stand shoulder to shoulder with her and unravel thread by thread, continue unraveling the flag. And as you can see in the video, sometimes they have conversations as they're doing it, but you can see here it's really, really a meticulous and tedious process. And every single thread has to be unraveled and untangled from the rest of it. And, clearly they're all sort of, tangled and very intricately woven together. So, this performative part of this piece really activates it. And as you mentioned, Addie, both of the titles of these works are verbs, and it is an ongoing process, both physically and then, of course, metaphorically, the idea of unraveling the elements of history that continue to persist related to the Confederacy and that history as well. The other work too, which I think later we'll show an image of, Unraveled, shows sort of the end result. It is a standalone piece on itself, but I think paired side by side, it does show, the end result. That work is 3 piles of thread. So it's a red pile, a white pile, and a blue pile. Kind of, the end of having unraveled all of these threads. And you can see them in the background there.
Yeah, and I don't know if folks can see that there is a little ledge underneath the the piece unraveling, so that as participants are putting their hands into the fibers and taking them apart, there is this collection of thread that is gathered on that little platform ledge that's in the gallery. And that video came from Mixed Greens, which is a gallery where Sonia Clarke showed in 2015. So here we go, is a detail of kind of what that stage of the process looks like. And I think one of the things that's really significant here is that this is a commercially produced flag. This is something that exists because there is a consumer market for it. Whereas Sonia Clarke made, the different works based off of and inspired by the Appomattox truce flag. And so I think, one of the things that is really clear here is that Clarke is talking about the persistence of history, but also very different ties to history, whether that is, the upholding or vaunting of white supremacy by sort of the manufacture of these kinds of items, or the, considered conversation that happens as people are standing shoulder to shoulder in an intimate physical space with Clarke, with other people around, really thinking about, why this object exists, how, the US continues to unmake structures of racism, and really think about, what it would, I can't help but think about what it would look like if Sonia Clarke couldn't find a Confederate battle flag to purchase and unmake. What would that world look like?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. This element of this symbol being so pervasive is such a big part of this work. It's such a familiar symbol. As you've pointed out, it's commercially available, and it's, even this symbol that's printed on everything from, beach towels to bathing suits to, lighters and things like that. And it's, I think, in many ways a little bit shocking that this symbol is so pervasive, because it is a symbol that represents divisiveness. Historically, it represented this divide within the country. And I think many elements of that linger today. Today it's still a very divisive symbol. For some people, it's representative of history or, pride in a, region of the country. But for many other Americans, it's a symbol of hate and white supremacy. Mm-hmm. And so I think, that divisiveness, Sonia Clarke is attempting to kind of breach that a little bit by physically bringing people in very close proximity in order to unravel this commercially available thing that exists in the world that carries such heavy symbolism.
Well, and I think that there's also a lot of kind of metaphorical structure that goes in with sort of the vocabulary of weaving and textiles. We might think of the fabric of society or the ties that bind. And I almost feel like Clarke is asking us to consider how using this symbol of sort of historical and contemporary white supremacy can prompt conversations around what needs to be unmade in order for folks to reconnect. And, Addie, you mentioned earlier that both unraveling and unraveled are verbs and that they sort of have this relationship. And I'd love to take a look at unraveled and sort of consider kind of what it feels like when the performance is, if not done, at least that performance has reached a conclusion. Mm-hmm. And just sort of thinking about these three piles of red, white, and blue thread, so kind of neatly formed on the ledge. Hannah, I'd be sort of curious to hear from you if you feel like it's fair to call these sort of a conclusion of unraveling, or if there's more of like, this is material that could become something new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, as you point out, it might be sort of a conclusion of one performance or one sort of iteration of this piece. But, the work that goes into unraveling these flags, both physically as well as metaphorically, is ongoing, of course. And I think, one thing that stands out to me when you see both the activation of unraveling as well as still images of it is that while these threads are being unraveled before they're being placed in these neat little piles, an impression of the flag remains behind, even as they are being unraveled. So, even the work that's going into that, there's still sort of this lingering impression of that symbol that sort of lasts until it's separated out like this. I think one thing that's striking looking at Unraveled and looking at these three piles of flags is that, of course, without the context of seeing the Confederate battle flag, this could just as easily be, the three colors of the American flag. Mm-hmm. And so there's certainly that connection there. And, one thing that Sonya does so brilliantly in her work is to not only address history, but to redress it. And, tying into the theme of Counterstory, to call attention to these parts of history that are so often overlooked. And so I think seeing the two paired together, you can kind of see and think about, these threads of history that might still be quite tightly interwoven, I think, into contemporary time.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really well put point. This idea that these flags are, as manufactured objects, extraordinarily tightly woven. The warp and the weft are almost inextricable. So as we've talked about, this act of undoing is really hard work. It's time consuming, and it also requires cooperation. It's not something that one individual can do alone. And so I think that's a really beautiful metaphor for sort of where we need to look in terms of moving forward, and making America a space or a place that is more equitable. So just want to thank you, Hannah, for being with us for this first segment. We're gonna Hannah will be back with us towards the end. So if anyone has questions for her about the show or Sonia Clarke's work, we'll see her in about 20 minutes. So thanks, Hannah.
Thank you.
See you soon. Great. And so, as promised, we will be talking with Stephanie Syjuco, who should be coming on momentarily. And hi, Stephanie. Here we are. Great. So I'd like to introduce Stephanie Syjuco, whose work is currently on view at the Baltimore Museum of Art in her show, Stephanie Syjuco, Vanishing Point Overlay, which will be on view through May 16th. Stephanie is joining us live from California, where she is an associate professor of sculpture at UC Berkeley. So good afternoon to us, but good morning to you, Stephanie.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's really wonderful to be here in this context.
Yeah, we're so delighted to have you join us to talk about Counterstory as a theme, because it really pervades your work. And I thought we might start with a flag of your own, which is "To the Person Sitting in Darkness." And you can see it here outside of the historic entrance of the Baltimore Museum of Art. And, I think one of the things that folks might notice is that it looks faintly familiar, but there's also kind of some unrecognizable elements to it. So, Stephanie, could you tell us a little bit more about what we're seeing in this flag?
Sure, yeah. So, flying outside the museum is something that looks like a modified American flag. And what I'm really showing, though, is a design from 1904 that Mark Twain, the famed American writer, actually wrote about. And he designed this flag in the essay titled "To the Person Sitting in Darkness." And it was actually an anti-imperialist flag, and he was referencing America's intervention in the Philippines at the time. So this was actually his proposal for the Philippine flag, which, given that the United States was attempting to suppress a guerrilla resistance to its takeover of the Philippines, Twain suggested, why don't we replace the stars on the U.S. flag with skulls, and then the white of the stripes with black instead? And it really was his attempt to kind of show the negative effects of the colonizing experience in the Philippines.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really interesting. Sorry, Addie. We both get interested at the same time.
I know. Isn't that funny how that happens? Go ahead.
But I think it's interesting to consider how Twain was kind of suggesting to Filipinos and to the Philippines that they should use sort of an icon that is so often sort of politically framed as like a proud symbol for the U.S., but embedding, a critique of the U.S. political, the U.S. government's colonial relationship or imperialist relationship with the Philippines, and sort of like putting it out front, because flags are often what sort of identifies a country or a group first. And there's such an idea of identity and the possibility of building belonging or building coalition under a flag. And so I'd be interested in hearing more about kind of how you decided to take this historical design and bring it into the present, and kind of what ideas of belonging or political statement you're sort of seeing in place now.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're living right now in quite a polarizing context, and I think that's sort of stating the obvious. And when I first produced this work in 2019, we were still in the middle of the last presidential time period, and a lot of questions were swirling around how we define ourselves as a country, what our values are, as well as I guess precedents in terms of political resistance. And so, in thinking of a flag that was verbally designed over 100 years ago now, and so Twain's flag actually was never made. He described it. I thought it would be interesting to resuscitate it, given that we're still kind of having tensions over the meaning of this flag, and if it is a sign of, say, positive patriotism, or a kind of like supremacist nationalism. And so I think that by having it here, it's interesting because it's both historical, but it's also quite contemporary.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think, Stephanie, in our preliminary conversation, you talked a lot about how this flag you'd initially made it for St. Louis, correct? And how it was really sort of a representation of Mark Twain's ideas and sort of his flag. But I'm curious, how is it also your flag? How do his anti-imperialist words and your visualization of them reflect your own lived experience?
Yeah, well, I guess so. There's American history has so many kind of blank spots in terms of what stories we tell. So it's wonderful to be on a show with the focus of the Counterstory, and namely as an American, as myself as an American artist, but also a Filipino American artist. The United States' history with the Philippines is actually quite intertwined, but not very, I guess, spoken of. And so being an immigrant to the United States, but also having a very long generational family ties to the United States through its colonization of the Philippines. When I was invited to do a project at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis back in 2019. I was doing research on the local history, and it turns out, Twain was a Missouri native. Plus, there was a notorious 1904 World's Fair that took place in St. Louis, in which Filipinos had been imported to the United States to be put on display. And so the work was really site specific. It was for St. Louis, but I think transferring it also onto the facade of Baltimore also talks a lot about the resonance too of the recent uprising events in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, well, and I also think about how there are different flag codes associated with, like, if a U.S. flag is hung upside down, it's a distress symbol, and so I think that there is a lot of sensitivity to modifications of the U.S. flag as something that indicates that we need to pay more attention, and that this is not sort of, the standard U.S. flag hanging outside of a municipal building, but that this is a moment of increased focus and of increased reflection. And I know that in our pre-interview conversation, you'd also kind of brought up the point that there has been a popular misconception that Asian people in the U.S. are recent arrivals, and that there is this myth that like all of a sudden Asian immigrants showed up in the U.S. sometime in the 60s and 70s, and like poof, which is very far from the truth in terms of thinking about things like the persistent engagement of the U.S. with the Philippines in this particular instance, or the long history of Chinese migration to the U.S. and correspondingly the Chinese Exclusion Act, when the U.S. government decided that there was too much immigration from Asia within the U.S. So I think this is I think it's a really interesting work in terms of playing on both. On playing on history, but also recognizing that history continues to impact the present. There are still things that we need to sort of recognize as shaping our society and as shaping the safety of all members of our society. And also thinking about the way that political forces, as embodied by flags, don't always kind of allocate that safety equitably, or really think about kind of what everyone needs. So, I do appreciate that sort of continued resonance of the history in the present, and I'd like to turn to another body of work that previously debuted in Moscow, Russia, but that has new life here in Baltimore. So as we bring up rogue states, we've got another set of really visually compelling flags, but also flags that maybe seem initially unfamiliar to folks. So I love that you have described this as a United Nations Convention of Collective Anxiety, which is just such a great phrase. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about what this collection of flags sort of means to you and how you're hoping that visitors experience them.
Sure. Yeah. So I think what's also interesting is that, Sonia's work, as you were talking about earlier, is kind of a resuscitation of, existing flags, right? Like real ones that have existed historically, but need a refocus. Whereas the two flag projects that I'm showing are really, I wouldn't say fictional, but they've actually, they've not existed. They're sort of placeholders for both ideas of political engagement as well as anxieties of fear of foreign countries or the other. And so this project, which is called Rogue States, consists of 20 flags hung inside the museum, and they're kind of arranged similar to, say, what you would find in a United Nations convention of countries. And they also look vaguely familiar, so you could kind of tell colors or symbols that might appear to come from, countries that you may have seen a flag of, but they're all quite vague. And it turns out that these flags are actually, they're pulled from fictional American and European films in which a fake country was created to stand in for the enemy. And so, again, these are fictional, but the films themselves are really a reflection of the West's anxieties over, the other. And in many cases, these countries are, say, from the Middle East or Africa or Asia or, South and Central America. And by putting them all together, it just kind of shows a sort of collective anxiety of both America and Europe over its own borders, really.
Mm-hmm. And also sort of these perceived threats, right? These threats that are sort of manufactured in order to make a sense of provide a sense of argument for nationalism or sort of, isolationism in a way, which I think is really interesting. I know, Stephanie, for you, we've talked a lot actually about Sonia Clarke and her processes, some of which she's using found materials and deconstructing, and other ways she's creating her own works. Handwork is extremely important to you as well, I know. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how you say that sort of the making process is really a processing of ideas, and as well as sort of getting this tangible thing from your brain out into the world. So I'm really curious to hear more about your process for making this, from sort of the initial idea to the final flags that folks can see at the Baltimore Museum of Art.
Yeah. So thankfully, there's been a lot of research on flags. It turns out, there's a whole kind of culture of vexillologists, as they're called, who, obsess over flags. And, just doing research online, I found, entire websites devoted to deconstructing or examining fictional flags from movies. And so, I curated from a selection of titles that I thought were an interesting variety. So if one was at the museum, you can see a panel that talks about which flags go to which movies. And it's everything from, say, Die Hard 2 to Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. I mean, they're really all over the place in terms of what the films represent. But in making them, so I didn't hand make these flags. I actually worked with a commercial flag making company that usually specializes in both the production of American and state flags, as well as, sports flags. And I had them produce it using, their own traditional applique techniques. So it was important for me to actually do that. And, the New England Flag and Banner, based in Massachusetts, is really quite well known for their handmade flags.
It's really interesting.
Yeah. So, I want to go back to a note, to sort of the thought that these flags had to be created for the fictional environments of their films. In that, in some ways, it seems like a very direct sort of, popular culture reflection of maybe World War II anxieties or Cold War anxieties, and just sort of the way that whatever conflict of the moment kind of makes its way into movies. But I do think that there's something really significant about the fact that the filmmakers decided that they needed to have a flag associated with, the cast enemy or the perceived enemy within these films. And so I think it really speaks to the extent to which, flags do sort of codify a group in a way, and sort of make them knowable, make them, a little bit more bounded, and also maybe enter them into like the greater geopolitical realm of, thinking like, all right, here is the US as a country engaging with whatever sort of fictional nation or fictional paramilitary organization. It's just like so much is bound up in the iconography of having a flag as sort of conferring a degree of power and stability.
Well, yeah, and the flags, I mean, they literally function to create boundaries of, like who's in and who's out, right? So it's like if you if you have allegiance to a certain flag, you're really stating that, those are your values in opposition even to, someone else who stands under a different flag. So they really are a way to create, both affiliation and express values, but also to, create divides in a way. I mean, it is, a kind of promotion of nationalism, depending on how it's used.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I like this shot of the rotunda seeing, the rogue states above, where there's so much really explicit iconography, and you're really sort of playing up all of the things that countries or groups want to say about themselves or get sort of ascribed to them in the, in the shape of a flag. And then kind of pairing that hypervisibility with the play with a sort of muted visibility or invisibility, with the overlay pieces. And so I think, folks, if you can sort of see that there's these uplit, kind of draped with fabric, sculptures on pedestals, I'd like to kind of take a closer look at this kind of body of work that is part of your show. And really the way that you are both sort of thinking about the making of icons and the hiding of icons in Vanishing Point.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk this through. So in conjunction with both the flag outside, as well as the series of flags hanging in the rotunda, underneath the hanging flags are a series of 4 sculptures, and these are all pulled from the 19th century American collection in the Baltimore Museum of Art. And I worked with the curators to collect and, I guess, re-exhibit, only in a different manner, busts of American figures that were tied up to issues of white supremacy. And what's fascinating about doing this is that, you know, I was really, the notion that history is kind of embedded in all our objects is, you know, I think something to keep remembering. And in many cases too, these stories aren't really told. And so, you know, the backgrounds of these individuals are actually, you know, quite interesting in the sense that, you know, they were famous for their times, but their ties to, say, the Confederacy or, you know, white supremacy or secessionist values were actually not very highlighted. And so by reintroducing them to the public, but also kind of muting or, you know, by showing that they're there, but also trying to muffle their visibility, was a way for me to kind of think about how these stories are actually quite hidden normally. And, you know, instead of reintroducing these figures to the public and sharing, you know, and highlighting, I guess, their ties to white supremacist values, I did want to make them present, but also, I guess, to sort of muffle them in some way.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the ways in which you've done that, right? I think we may have an image of a label and the way it's been sort of redacted, if you will, and also the sort of that draping that you've created over those figures. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about sort of your techniques for muffling, if you will.
Yeah, so I love these labels because they kind of look like a mistake, which is that isn't an actual, you know, pixelation problem with your screen. The label themselves of the artworks are blurred out. And I did that strategically where, you know, the artist who made the busts, their name is still present, but the figure themselves, you know, the kind of problematic figure, their name is blurred and hard to read. And again, it was to sort of not re-platform or give them more attention, but to kind of speculate on what would it be like if, you know, they were not prominent, or if these values were not, you know, held strongly during the time. And covering the fabric is actually a sheer digital print that is this gray and white checkerboard pattern that is pulled directly from Adobe Photoshop, which is, you know, a common image editing software. And so it's considered the transparency layer that's at the very back of a digital file. And it's supposed to be invisible, but it's highly visible at the same time. So that's kind of my tie-in with the notion of how white supremacy functions in the United States, which is that it's actually in everything. It's so visibly invisible all at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Also really gets to this idea too that I think the viewers have a responsibility and an opportunity to interact with these objects by, in a way, projecting their own sort of catalog of images in their mind, like who would be under, what figure would be veiled under this particular fabric, and it really sort of begins. I hope for viewers it begins to encourage them to question sort of even what the catalog of available images are of people in their mind that they might sort of surface and project onto this particular fabric.
Mm-hmm. And along those lines, you know, because I work with labels at the BMA, so I'm gonna chime in here. We do actually have 2 sets of labels. You know, the one that we showed that is in the style of the Jacobs Gallery. So if you were walking into any adjacent room, you would see that same font, you'd see that same sort of graphic design. Obviously, you would not see the blurring, but that, Stephanie, you have kind of given these busts, or rather your intervention onto these busts, that work has its own title. So if I'm not mistaken, this is Founding Father. And so, speaking to that idea of running through like, well, who are all the founding fathers? And kind of making out like, well, does this look more like George Washington? Who knows? Just sort of, and then having to recognize like, what is the history that you know? What is the history that you don't know? And really thinking about the way that we are all implicated in the constant construction of history. Even if I think, the act of an individual is sort of making big historical shifts writ large, like that can be hard to attain, but like we are all making choices that inform history sort of every day.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think what we'll do now, as we think about all of us being a part of a broader conversation, is we'll bring Hannah Shambroom back on. And if folks have questions, we are happy to take them. We're live, so catch us while you have us. And we'll also get a chance to, continue talking with you, Stephanie, about kind of your work and its ideas of Counterstory, especially alongside Sonia Clarke's work, which, I think that there are such beautiful parallels between your two practices. So maybe to get us started, I think it might be interesting to think about, how you work with, like how you choose your materials, because both you, Stephanie, and also Sonia, there's such a strong conceptual practice and underpinning to the work, but you're not making sets of directions silhouette style. This is very much, there is a physicality to the work, and I'd be interested in hearing more about how you pick the stuff of the object, especially in thinking about how that material has its own kind of historical formation and weight.
Yeah. Well, I think what's beautiful about both our works is that, again, turning back to textiles, which has such a rich history and is usually associated with everything from, say, the domestic arts to intense craft to very political things as well. I think it's really nice to think about textiles as both the like present in everything also. Right? I mean, it's literally the stuff that we clothe ourselves in, and by by insisting and keeping bringing the notion of textiles forward in terms of the kind of political ramifications. I think it's great because it just takes it out of the feeling that somehow it's just women's work. I really just to bring that up, like that's sort of like this assumption in many cases, that, and I think to keep insisting and then resisting at the same time, both those things happening is really powerful.
Absolutely. I'm curious, I think it's a great question for Hannah as well, in terms of what we know about Sonia Clarke's sort of selection of objects. And she's talked a lot about how she chooses found materials because of the sort of meaning that people imbue upon them and sort of the way that we look at and use them. So Hannah, I'm curious, I know we talked just about her textile works, but if you might want to touch on a little bit of some of the other materials that she's using and why she's making those choices.
Yeah, definitely. And I also just want to touch on something Stephanie just said, because I think it really parallels Sonia Clarke's work so well when you said that, we're constantly touching textiles. And Sonia Clarke has made that exact same point, something that she's talked about in her use of fabric, that, at almost all points of our day, we're touching some kind of textile, whether it's clothing or sheets or a towel or a rug or something like that, that it's just something that's constantly touching our bodies. But most people have no idea how those fabrics are created and how they're made. And, that process is so time consuming and so intricate. So that certainly overlaps. That just really caught my attention. But Addie, yes, there's so many different types of materials that Sonya uses. I think one that's really interesting is her use of human hair. And that's sort of a material that she gathers. Some of it is her own hair that she's used and brought in. Some of it is other people's hair that she has gathered from salons and things like that. And she often uses it and incorporates that material into other works that include found objects. So, she's sort of combining, she has called hair the primordial textile. It's something that it's, sort of the, most original organic material that you could have, grown on our own heads, and the connection to DNA and to our ancestors, and sort of bringing that into prefabricated objects. For example, she has replaced the strands of hair in violin bows with human hair, both straight blonde hair as well as a dreadlock. And she has also replaced the keys of a typewriter with, sort of tightly coiled black hair as well. And in those works, speaking of the idea of a counterstory and presenting, different pieces of history that are often overlooked. In those works, she is sort of using that to bring a Black presence into places and areas where it's often been overlooked. In the example of those two works, into the field of creative writing or classical music.
I think that's also really interesting in terms of, Stephanie, you talked about muffling. And muffling, as I think about it more, it really means that there's more sound that you would expect and you don't get it. And so thinking about, Sonia Clarke's violin bow that has human hair as opposed to horse hair, or, a dreadlock, like, it's still going to make a sound. It's just not the sound that we have been taught to expect. And so I think that is, a really sort of beautiful function in both of your work of making the expectation known, but really shifting the focus to the thing that you weren't expecting, and allowing time for that sort of that reconsideration of just sort of how naturalized some things are in visual and material culture, and really making them something that is so constructed, and also that you think about, like, well, why do I know this? Like, and what don't I know about it?
I think there's certainly an element of surprise and sort of unexpectedness in both of the works or sets of works we're thinking about. And just for those who haven't seen the Sonia Clarke show or curious to know more about it, she actually someone did play that bow, right? They actually used it to create sound, which is really fascinating. So yeah, I think subverting expectations is such an important part of both Clarke's work and yours as well, Stephanie. So I just yeah.
I mean, there's also something very interesting about how appropriative, our projects are, in the sense that, pulling from real history, and then, that slight modification. So, the amount of invention on there is definitely strong, but I think it's, deeply rooted in sort of icons and objects that already exist.
Yeah, I'm also really struck, I think, with your work as well as Sonia Clarke's, with this element of using fabric and textiles, both sort of as a cloak or like a shroud to cover something, while at the same time revealing this whole other side of history, or this alternate story that we might be less familiar with, and sort of the duality of that, of, that type of fabric or cloth, both covering something as well as revealing something.
That's nice to think about, sort of the interiority and exteriority of fabric, that sort of, depending upon which way you orient it, the fabric sees both sides, we're the ones who are sort of either on the inside or on the outside of the fabric, which I don't know, I think is sort of is interesting to consider as we're, being asked to consider what we know through different vantage points as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
we have a comment. I want to make sure if there are any questions. I just wanted to check on our comments. Well, I really am so grateful for your time, Hannah, and yours, Stephanie, and for all of you for joining us today. Did we have a question?
Actually, we just got a late-breaking, quite substantial question. This is from Lauren Hoffman. And Lauren, Stephanie, they say, this is for you, Stephanie. I think the draping in your vanishing point piece is a great starting off point for people to talk about how white supremacy is tied into so many aspects of our society. Mm-hmm. My question for any or all of you is, what are your thoughts on how to address white supremacy within museums and museum culture at large, outside of an exhibition of Stephanie or Sonia's work? For example, how are museums looking at their permanent collections? Lauren, this is a fantastically large question. Thank you for delivering it just in time.
Oh, I'd love to hear what the museum folks think, so I'll take it back.
Yeah. Well, I think that we're, I'll speak for the BMA, but I think one of the things that that sort of gave genesis to this show in particular of BMA NMWA is the recognition that, and this is not about white supremacy specifically, but also what isn't, was the recognition that we had this shared mission to foreground the work of women artists and acquire and exhibit women artists on the BMA side with our 2020 Vision Initiative. But then, the National Museum of Women in the Arts was founded because of the structural underrepresentation of women in the arts. And so I think that we do need to look at our permanent collections as places where history is both documented and silenced or omitted. So, the BMA is and has been in the news very publicly for our moves to reshape the collection and to better show a comprehensive and equitable history of artistic excellence that does include women, that does include people of color, that does include, underrepresented artists from well beyond the white male Eurocentric Western canon. And that sort of questions that historical formation of canon as something that, what does it mean to continue replicating it in terms of what we have in our collection?
I would also, I'm curious if Hannah has any thoughts on this as well. I mean, I think just to sort of, reiterate what Veronica has said, the Women's Museum was founded opened in 1987 to sort of address head-on some of the issues of at least gender inequity in the arts, specifically in art museums. But I think there's certainly a trickle-down or trickle-up effect in the arts world broadly, that galleries often underrepresent artists of color, female artists, or women identifying artists. And then unfortunately, there's sort of that sort of trickle effect in sort of the works that are acquired, collected, given to institutions. But I also think, and I'm not in a position of curatorial authority, but I would say that museum staff recognizes that each of us makes decisions every day about what we choose to show or what we choose to keep in storage, how we write labels or other interpretive texts about objects. And so really acknowledging that that is a point of privilege, and also being able to take a step back and potentially tap into sort of our immediate community and really sort of engage with them in ways to make sure that our institution is representing the community that it is situated in, right?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with what you just said, Addie. I think also, on the curatorial side of things, we are continually looking at the collection through a critical lens. Of course, beyond addressing gender inequality in the arts, it's really important to address, the even deeper inequalities that people of color face in terms of art being represented in museums. And that is something that is, constantly front of mind when looking at our collection. And I think also is, such an important consideration in terms of thinking about our collection galleries as well as special exhibitions, whose stories are being told, whose work are we representing, and then of course also whose voices are we bringing in. So all of those things are, definitely front of mind, and, constantly being considered in terms of the collection as well as special exhibitions.
Yeah. I think, and what's interesting too, if I can just throw in a couple things. So I think Sonia's project with the flag, it originated in the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian. And last year, I was also a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow in the National Museum of American History as well. And so I think what's fascinating is that especially when dealing with historical collections, you really are limited, by what is there. Really, and so whether those stories can be pulled forward or whether it means that the collection itself needs to expand, I think those are some key questions, because in the end, artists, even though we do kind of provide this, counter story or, the ability to relook at something, we are kind of temporal. We're temporary in the sense that these interventions are really, they're not permanent. They're meant to be, a relook, but the whole restructuring of, the information found in museums, I think that's a challenge that's going to take a long time, because we're up against centuries of collecting practices that were not reverse.
Yeah. Yes. And I think the crux of sort of kind of what does it mean to collect more progressively? How do we do that both through purchases and also through a strategy of cultivating folks who kind of believe in the mission and want to give works out of their collection to the museum? There's a whole sort of, I think, economic and art market aspect that also needs to be considered, which is, I'm going to say, a whole other hour's conversation.
But it's a good question, and I'm glad that question got raised. Yeah, so
it is. Yeah,
thank you,
I think it's really
yes, for sure. Well, we are at 1:00 here, at least on the East Coast, and I want to be mindful of time, and just to say again, thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Stephanie, for your time. Thank you all of us for joining us, for your comments and questions. No apologies necessary, Lauren. Thank you for your question. We appreciate it. And I just wanted to say we're doing this again next month, so please join us on May 11th. The topic will be just making art, making a difference, when we discuss art making as an act of advocacy and community support. So we hope to see you next month.
Yes, and if you're a lover of textiles, there will be quilts from G's Bend. So the fabric love continues.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much, Stephanie and Hannah.
Nice to be here.
Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.